So, hi guys, Tim and Toby here for another episode, episode 8, this one will be, of how Germany lost the war, and this one is everybody's, well I guess everybody's famous ideal situation to be in, which was crossing the Rhine in March 1945, or specifically the 25th of March 1945. So if you think about it, the Americans have just halted the Germans and pushed them back from the Ardennes in Belgium. The British also as well were coming up the same route. Failed attempt made in Holland a couple of months earlier by the British and American troops, and so the Germans has crossed over the Rhine, and they've blown up all the bridges. But there's one big gap where basically it was just open for the Allies at the Rhine, and so on the 25th of March 1945 the British troops basically went across to cross the Rhine under a big heavy smoke barrage bombardment by the British Royal Artillery from of course their side, and they started across. This was known as Operation Plunder. Typical British, that is, Operation Plunder. But Operation Plunder took a couple thousand men in buffaloes with basically amphibious landing crafts to transport infantry over to the other side. But how it worked out with the tide and everything in these buffaloes, say if kind of the river it was basically flowing downstream, was flowing that way. You got one side of the bank and the other side of the bank of the Rhine. The river was flowing up that way, so the British in their buffaloes, amphibious vehicles, had to kind of go at a right angle, because if you go out that way you would just be drifted off into the mouth of the river, the main bit of the river. But if you kind of go at an angle, kind of like that, you'll be basically kind of directed to it, to the mouth of the river, which that was probably their way. So you had Dorsets, you had Highlanders, you had basically every regiment you can think of coming up from Normandy into these buffaloes crossing the Rhine in March 1945, which is, very famous, which my grandfather at that point did as well. Very famous incident, kind of an event that one veteran was telling us on a kind of a documentary, which he was part of the Black Watch regiment actually. One buffalo got up ashore and couldn't really get up the hill a bit, and kind of tipped backwards and then smashed on the ground. And luckily didn't tip backwards, but it tipped forwards on the ground. And they were doing so whilst the Highlanders were playing their mouth organ and being all cheerful at, and worked fine. The other side, which is the American side of the crossing the Rhine, which was known as Operation Varsity, and it basically used the US Airborne Division, the US 17th Airborne Corps, to drop into the heart of Germany, because both Allies and Canadians as well were crossing the Rhine to get into the Ruhr, the factory and heartland of Germany. So, Toby, do you want to talk us a bit more about it?
Yes, so, think of World War II as a tale of two armies. So, the German Wehrmacht had dominated the fighting early, but it had gone downhill really ever since. By 1945, losses were soaring, replacements weren't keeping up, and much of the German army consisted of Volkssturm, People's Assault Units, old men and boys from the Reich with sketchy training and equipment. German weapons, the Tiger tanks and Messerschmitt 262 aircraft, despite all the hype, were incredibly unreliable, and they were just in far too few numbers. And the end game of the Western Front all arrived in the Battle of the Ruhr Pocket. So the Americans, Montgomery, so Tim was just talking about Operation Plunder, took a 4-hour, 4,000-gun artillery barrage. That broke through a lot of the German lines, and they crossed the Rhine, basically. They crashed the Rhine, as it was known. By the second day of the battle, having the Allies were now rampaging forward, Walter Mulder, who was in command of the army group there, basically lost all contact with the commander of his 15th Army, General Gustav Adolf von Zangen, who was basically unable to contact by radio because everything had imploded. And then Berlin deemed the whole area Fortress Ruhr. This would have been a catastrophic disaster for the entirety of the population, because it would have ended in house-to-house fighting, vicious little defensive battles. Inside this pocket, it really became just an absolute hell on earth. You know, the Germans really were with their back against the wall. If they resisted in a town, what would happen? Well, the Americans would bring down heavy artillery and just destroy everything there, because, and, you know, that's what the correct tactic in that situation was. I mean, you can't really clear a town without literally just clearing it of enemy troops, which is unfortunate. There's actually an interesting story which kind of hints at the ferocity and speed of the American advance, which is Gisselin, which is a village near Paderborn, which is where there's a big German army training ground, were attending a delayed Easter Mass on Tuesday, April 3rd, when they heard the clanking and roaring of engines in the streets of their village. Now, they thought it might have been, German vehicles maybe moving forward. Herr Vicker, they are here, a woman whispered, and at that very moment, 76 cannon from a Sherman poked through the church door, trained directly on the altar. The situation was defused by Americans entering the church and kneeling and praying, taking part in the Mass. But it really, one of the great tragedies of this battle was, because it's the main industrial area, that's, the reason the Dam Busters raid happened, and all of the other bombing of that area. The battle wrought enormous physical destruction. Factories closed and production ceased, as did the distribution of food and goods to the region's cities and suburbs. Electricity, water and sewage all broke down in this densely populated area, and that's a recipe for a disastrous outbreak of disease if the battle dragged on. So people rushed to their local banks to pull out their Reich marks, even though, the Reich is crumbling all around them, literally like one of the bits of footage of like a cliff collapsing almost. And, that currency was soon worthless completely. And then, Russians and Polish forced labourers from the Nazi slave empire escaped and were scrounging really for what they could, dying of hunger. Then, the Nazi party really was a dead duck here. It's, the local Gauleiter or whatever would often demand a fight to the finish and then just, flee away somewhere else. And would be a hanging, or SS specifically units would actually be hanging any deserters, which could literally just be anyone at this stage, as a lot of soldiers had lost their papers and were in just full retreat. Absolute disaster for the Germans, and the number of prisoners, 317,000 men, twice the US intelligence estimate. Really ridiculous. So, what actually happened, though, to the commanders? So, Walter Mudel, Field Marshal Mudel, crushed by the totality of defeat, as well as the news the Soviet government had listed him as a war, very kind, known as on the Eastern Front as the Führer's fireman, because he was sent wherever the situation was worse to kind of sort it out. What is left for a defeated general? He asked his chief of staff. When his chief of staff did not respond, Model answered his own question. In ancient times they took poison. Like Hitler, Model had often complained about the cowardice of Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus in letting himself being taken prisoner by the Soviets at Stalingrad. So what did he do? Well, Joseph Goebbels in Berlin condemned the surrender of Model's traitorous Ruhr army, and the field marshal took leave of his aides in a wood outside of Duisburg and shot himself with his 6.35mm service pistol. Hand you back to Tim.
Oh, thanks, Toby. Thanks for that. Yeah, so as Toby was just explaining there, the collapse of all German factories and government really in the Ruhr pocket, which also was exactly what the German army and German officers were, I mean the whole Wehrmacht, were doing, is collapsing at this point. Because they knew, all they had to do was defend Germany to the last, and by March and into April, as they knew that the Russians were coming up, up and in basically another alley, a back alley, that they set up barbed wire fencing. They set up machine gun nests, posts all around Berlin, because Berlin was the final basically home stretch for the Allies. And just before I end the video, when the British troops and American troops got into the Ruhr, as Toby was explaining, hand-to-hand fighting, you would get Bren guns being fired from the hip, you would get Germans fleeing out, surrendering, and literally it was a knife-to-knife fist fight in the Ruhr pocket. Is there anything else you want to just quickly say, Toby, before I end the video?
Not really, other than to reiterate, yes, there was a little more fighting in Holland and other places, but after that happened, and one of the reasons it's happened was the Ardennes, which we've mentioned in a previous series of videos. There was really no real hope Germany was going to claw its way back to even any semblance of a tall victory. So yeah, I'll hand you back over to Tim.
Yes, well, just described. And also, of course, you got the Canadians at Groningen, but that will be a separate video. That was April 1945. So, thanks for watching, guys, and we'll see you in the next episode 9, which will be about the basic Russian advance to Berlin and the Kurland pocket and all the different basically German scraps of what was left. So, thanks for watching, guys. Have a good one, and we'll see you in the next episode. Bye.